The American Revolution did not begin with muskets on Lexington Green. It began in the uneasy aftermath of victory. In 1763, Britain had just emerged from the 7 Years' War as one of the most powerful empires in the world. In North America, British victory over France transformed the map. Canada was now British. French imperial power had been broken east of the Mississippi. Colonists who had feared French forts and French alliances on their northern and western frontiers now looked out at a continent that seemed open with possibility. But imperial victory came with imperial problems. Britain's war debt was enormous. Defending North America was expensive. British officials believed the colonies had benefited from imperial protection and should help pay for it. They also believed the empire had become too loose, too smuggling-friendly, and too difficult to govern. The old habits of colonial self-management looked irresponsible to officials in London. For many colonists, those same habits looked like rights. They were British subjects. They claimed the liberties of Englishmen. Their colonial assemblies taxed them locally. Their merchants had long navigated trade rules with flexibility. Their towns debated, petitioned, organized, and resisted. When Britain tried to tighten control after 1763, many colonists did not experience it as routine administration. They experienced it as a constitutional alarm. The Proclamation of 1763 tried to limit settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, partly to stabilize relations with native nations after Pontiac's War, and partly to control expansion. To British officials, this was order. To land speculators, frontier settlers, and ambitious colonists, it felt like a barrier placed across the future. British troops remained in North America. Customs enforcement became more serious. Officials spoke of revenue, order, and authority. Colonists heard danger. At first, most did not want independence. They wanted what they believed they already possessed: self-government within the empire, protection of property, trial by jury, local consent to taxation, and the rights of British subjects. But between 1763 and 1775, each imperial solution created a colonial reaction. Each reaction convinced British leaders that stronger measures were necessary. Each stronger measure convinced more colonists that power itself had become the problem. Episode 0 is the story of that escalation. It is the story of how an argument over empire became a movement of resistance, and how resistance became a road to war. The first great shock came through revenue. In 1764, Parliament passed the Sugar Act. It revised duties on molasses and other goods, but more importantly, it signaled a new seriousness about enforcement. Smuggling would be harder. Customs officers would be more aggressive. Cases might be heard in admiralty courts without juries. Merchants complained, lawyers warned, pamphlets circulated. But the Sugar Act was only the beginning. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act. This law required stamped paper for many legal and commercial documents: newspapers, pamphlets, court papers, licenses, contracts, playing cards, and more. Unlike external trade duties, the Stamp Act reached directly into daily colonial life. Printers, lawyers, merchants, tavern keepers, and ordinary readers could feel it. The phrase that rose against it became famous: no taxation without representation. Colonists argued that Parliament could regulate imperial trade, but taxation for revenue required consent through representatives. Since the colonies had no elected members in Parliament, direct parliamentary taxation violated their rights. British defenders answered that Parliament represented the whole empire virtually, whether colonists voted or not. This was not a small disagreement over money. It was a disagreement over sovereignty. In Virginia, Patrick Henry's Resolves pushed the argument sharply. In Massachusetts and other colonies, protest grew louder. Printers filled pages with essays, assemblies debated, merchants worried about business, crowds gathered. The Stamp Act Congress met in New York in October 1765, bringing delegates from several colonies into common action. They petitioned the King and Parliament, asserting colonial rights while still speaking as loyal British subjects. On the streets, resistance became more forceful. Stamp distributors were threatened, pressured, and sometimes attacked. Effigies hung from trees. Homes of officials could be damaged. In Boston, Andrew Oliver resigned as stamp distributor under pressure. Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson's house was violently attacked by a crowd, a moment that frightened even some opponents of the Stamp Act. The colonies were discovering a dangerous truth. Constitutional arguments could become street power. By late 1765, the act was nearly impossible to enforce in many places. Without local cooperation, stamped paper could not easily move. Without stamped paper, courts and commerce risked paralysis. Britain had tried to raise revenue. Instead, it had taught the colonies how to resist together. The resistance to the Stamp Act created new political habits. Some of those habits were organized by groups remembered as the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty were not a single neat organization with one office and one command structure. They were networks of activists, artisans, merchants, printers, laborers, and local leaders who coordinated pressure against imperial measures. In Boston, New York, Newport, and other towns, they turned public opinion into action. Their world was made of taverns, printing presses, wharves, meeting houses, workshops, and streets. They used symbols. Liberty trees became gathering places. Effigies made political enemies visible. Songs, toasts, newspapers, and handbills carried messages through communities. Boycotts gave ordinary consumers a role in imperial resistance. Non-importation agreements pressured British merchants by refusing British goods. This mattered because politics was expanding. Colonial assemblies still mattered. Elite lawyers and merchants still mattered. But crowd politics now mattered too. People outside formal office could shape events. A printer could spread arguments. A dock worker could join a protest. A woman managing household purchases could support non-importation. A tavern conversation could become a committee action. That expansion gave resistance energy. It also created fear. Supporters of imperial authority saw mobs, disorder, and intimidation. Even some colonists who opposed British policy worried that popular protest might become uncontrollable. The attack on Hutchinson's home showed how quickly constitutional resistance could become personal violence. The Sons of Liberty lived in that tension. They spoke the language of liberty and rights, but they also used pressure that could be frightening. They helped build solidarity, but they also helped teach communities how to punish dissent. This was one of the revolution's early contradictions. Resistance to power often required organization. Organization often required discipline. Discipline sometimes became coercion. A movement defending liberty could still make enemies afraid. The British government watched these developments with anger and alarm. Officials believed authority was being humiliated. Colonists believed rights were being defended. By 1766, British merchants hurt by colonial boycotts urged repeal. Parliament retreated from the Stamp Act, but it did not retreat from its claim of power. In 1766, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. Across the colonies, news of repeal brought celebration. Bells rang, bonfires burned, loyal toasts were offered to the king. Many colonists believed they had defended their rights while remaining inside the British Empire. Resistance had worked, but the same year, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act. The Declaratory Act stated that Parliament had authority to make laws binding the colonies in all cases whatsoever. That phrase mattered. From the British perspective, repeal solved a practical problem, while the Declaratory Act protected constitutional supremacy. Parliament could remove a bad policy without admitting that colonists had a right to resist parliamentary taxation. From the colonial perspective, repeal was victory, but the Declaratory Act was a warning. If Parliament claimed power in all cases whatsoever, then what protection did colonial rights truly have? For a short time, the crisis seemed to quiet. Many people wanted it to quiet. Merchants wanted trade, families wanted stability. Assemblies wanted normal politics. Few colonists in 1766 imagined a full war for independence. But the argument had changed. Before the Stamp Act, colonial resistance had often been local and practical. After the Stamp Act, colonists had learned to think continentally. They had held a congress. They had coordinated petitions. They had used boycotts. They had pressured officials. They had seen Parliament retreat. Britain had learned lessons too. British officials saw that colonial protest could defeat policy. They worried that if Parliament did not assert itself, the empire would become ungovernable. They believed authority had to mean something. So both sides came out of the Stamp Act crisis with confidence and suspicion. Colonists believed resistance could defend liberty. Parliament believed its authority had to be preserved. The next crisis would come from Charles Townshend, who believed he had found a better way to raise revenue. In 1767, Parliament passed the Townshend Acts. These measures placed duties on imported goods such as glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. Townshend believed external duties would be less objectionable than the internal Stamp Act. Many colonists disagreed. If the purpose was revenue, they argued, the constitutional problem remained. The Townshend duties also funded imperial officials, which threatened the power of colonial assemblies. If governors and judges could be paid from parliamentary revenue rather than local grants, colonial leverage would weaken. Resistance returned. John Dickinson's letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania argued that the issue was not the size of a tax, but the principle behind it. Colonial assemblies protested. Merchants renewed non-importation agreements. Women organized homespun production and consumer resistance, making politics visible in cloth, tea tables, and household choices. In Boston, customs enforcement intensified. The seizure of John Hancock's ship Liberty in 1768 helped inflame tensions. Crowds protested. Customs officials feared for their safety and withdrew to Castle William in the harbor. British leaders concluded that Boston was slipping beyond control. Troops were sent to occupy the town. The arrival of British soldiers in Boston changed daily life. Red-coated regulars stood in streets, competed for work, enforced imperial presence, and reminded residents that political dispute now had a military face. Soldiers and civilians insulted each other. Fights broke out. Suspicion hardened. To British officials, troops preserved order. To many Bostonians, troops looked like occupation. This is how escalation works. Attacks leads to protest. Protest leads to enforcement. Enforcement leads to troops. Troops create incidents. Incidents create martyrs and propaganda. Each side claims the other forced the next step. By 1770, Boston was tense, cold, and combustible. The spark came on King Street. On March 5, 1770, tension in Boston turned deadly. A confrontation began between townspeople and British soldiers. Insults flew, snowballs, ice, and objects were thrown. A crowd gathered around a small group of soldiers near the custom house. The soldiers were frightened, angry, and surrounded. Then they fired. 5 colonists died, including Crispus Attucks, a man of African and native ancestry who became one of the most remembered victims of the night. Others were wounded. The event quickly became known as the Boston Massacre. The word massacre was political. Patriot leaders understood the power of the event. Paul Revere's famous engraving, based on Henry Pelham's image, portrayed British soldiers firing in disciplined cruelty at innocent civilians. The image was not a neutral record, it was propaganda. And it was effective. The soldiers were put on trial. John Adams, despite opposing British policy, defended them. He believed the law had to matter even in a political crisis. Several soldiers were acquitted. 2 were convicted of manslaughter and branded. Adams's defense is important because it complicates the story. Patriot resistance did not always mean rejecting legal principle. For Adams, British policy could be dangerous, while British soldiers still deserved a fair trial. The Boston Massacre became memory, ritual, and warning. Every year, Patriot speakers commemorated the dead. The event proved in their telling that standing armies among a free people were dangerous. British troops had not calmed Boston, they had created bloodshed. Parliament repealed most Townshend duties in 1770, but kept the tax on tea as a symbol of authority. Again, Britain retreated without surrendering the principle. Again, colonists accepted partial victory without forgetting the warning. For a few years, the crisis seemed quieter, but the machinery of resistance did not disappear. The years after 1770 can look calm if the story is told too quickly. They were not calm, the tea tax remained. Customs enforcement continued. Memories of the massacre stayed alive. Colonial newspapers kept arguments circulating. Political leaders learned to communicate across distance with increasing skill. In 1772, the Gaspee Affair showed how combustible the imperial system remained. The Gaspee, a British customs schooner enforcing trade laws near Rhode Island, ran aground while pursuing a colonial vessel. A group of colonists boarded and burned it. The British investigation alarmed colonists, especially because suspects might be taken to Britain for trial. To many Americans, this threatened trial by local jury and revived fears of arbitrary power. Committees of correspondence became crucial. In Massachusetts, Samuel Adams and others helped create networks that allowed towns to share information, coordinate responses, and keep political energy alive. The committees turned scattered communities into a communication system. This was one of the most important developments before the war. Revolutions require stories that travel. They require people in one town to believe that events in another town matter to them. They require local grievances to become shared grievances. Committees of correspondence did that work. They warned of threats. They circulated resolutions. They named enemies of liberty. They made resistance organized before independence was even a mainstream demand. The colonies were still not united in the way they would later claim to be. There were loyalists, moderates, cautious merchants, enslaved people with different stakes, native nations watching colonial expansion, and many ordinary people who wanted peace more than politics. But the infrastructure of resistance was growing. When the next crisis came, it would not fall into silence. It would fall into a network. That crisis came with tea. The Tea Act of 1773 was designed partly to rescue the financially troubled East India Company. It allowed the company to ship tea directly to the colonies and sell it through selected consignees, making legal tea cheaper than smuggled tea in many cases. British officials thought colonists might accept a bargain. Many colonists saw a trap. The tea was cheaper, but the tax remained. If colonists bought the tea, they would be accepting Parliament's authority to tax them. The issue was not simply price, it was principle. It was also fear of monopoly, favoritism, and political control through commerce. Resistance appeared in several ports. In Philadelphia and New York, tea ships were pressured not to unload. In Charleston, tea was landed but stored unsold. Boston became the hardest case. Governor Thomas Hutchinson insisted the law must be obeyed. The tea ships could not simply leave without unloading and paying duties. Patriot leaders insisted the tea must not be landed. Crowds gathered. Meetings swelled. The Old South Meeting House became a center of crisis. The deadline approached. On December 16, 1773, thousands gathered to decide what could be done. When no legal solution appeared, a group of men, some disguised as Mohawk Indians, moved toward the ships. They boarded the Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver. Then they destroyed the tea. Chest after chest went into Boston Harbor. The action was disciplined in some ways. Property beyond the tea was mostly protected, and participants tried to prevent theft. But it was still the destruction of valuable private property connected to imperial law. For patriots, it became a bold defense of liberty. For British officials, it was lawless defiance. The Boston Tea Party made compromise far harder. Britain would answer with punishment. In 1774, Parliament passed measures meant to punish Massachusetts and restore authority. The colonists called them the Intolerable Acts. In Britain, they were known as the Coercive Acts. The Boston Port Act closed Boston Harbor until the destroyed tea was paid for. This struck directly at the town's economy. Workers, merchants, sailors, and families all felt the pressure. The Massachusetts Government Act altered the colony's charter and limited local self-government. Town meetings were restricted. Many officials would be appointed rather than locally chosen. The Administration of Justice Act allowed certain royal officials accused of crimes to be tried elsewhere, raising colonial fears that officials could escape local accountability. A new quartering act strengthened concern about troops among civilians. The Quebec Act, passed around the same period, expanded Quebec's boundaries and protected Catholic practice there. Many Protestant colonists viewed it suspiciously, especially because it seemed to block Western ambitions and strengthen a different model of imperial government. British leaders intended to isolate Massachusetts. Instead, they helped unite the colonies. Food and supplies flowed toward Boston from other colonies. Sympathy spread. If Parliament could remake Massachusetts' government, what protected any colony? If Boston could be punished until it submitted, what stopped the same method elsewhere? This was the moment when the crisis became truly continental. Many colonists still hoped for reconciliation. But reconciliation now required Britain to step back from laws passed to prove that Britain would not step back. In Massachusetts, royal authority weakened outside Boston. County conventions gathered. Courts were pressured or closed. Militia companies drilled. Towns began acting as if legitimate power no longer came from the royal government. The empire had tried to discipline one colony. It had revealed how many others feared they might be next. In September 1774, delegates from 12 colonies met in Philadelphia at the First Continental Congress. Georgia did not send delegates, but the gathering was still extraordinary. Men from different colonies, with different economies, religions, political cultures, and local concerns, came together to respond to the imperial crisis. They were not yet declaring independence. That matters. Many delegates wanted rights within the empire. They petitioned the king. They argued that Parliament had violated constitutional limits. They sought unity without closing every door to reconciliation. But they also acted. The Congress endorsed the Continental Association, a broad system of non-importation, non-consumption, and eventually non-exportation, designed to pressure Britain economically. Local committees would enforce the agreement, inspect merchants, and monitor behavior. This created a new layer of political authority. Committees in towns and counties now had power to decide who supported liberty and who betrayed it. Boycotts became tests of loyalty. Ordinary choices became political acts. A cup of tea, a bolt of cloth, a shipment of goods, a public statement, all could place a person inside or outside the movement. The Suffolk Resolves, adopted in Massachusetts and endorsed by Congress, rejected the coercive acts and encouraged resistance. Massachusetts was becoming the forward edge of the conflict. Royal Governor Thomas Gage faced an impossible task. He commanded British troops in Boston, but outside the town, royal authority was slipping. The Massachusetts Provincial Congress formed as a rival government. Militia reorganized. Minutemen prepared to respond quickly. By late 1774, the colonies had not chosen independence, but they had chosen resistance. The next question was whether resistance could remain political or whether it would become military. The answer came through gunpowder. Before the shooting war began, both sides understood the importance of military supplies. Gunpowder, muskets, cannon, and ammunition were not symbols. They were power. If British forces could seize colonial supplies, resistance would weaken. If colonists could protect them, political defiance could become armed defense. In September 1774, General Gage seized gunpowder from a powder house at Charlestown. Rumors spread that blood had been shed. Thousands of militia began moving before learning the rumor was false. This became known as the powder alarm. The alarm mattered because it showed how ready Massachusetts was to mobilize. A false report could bring armed men into motion. The countryside was wired for reaction. Riders, bells, town networks, and militia companies could turn rumor into movement with startling speed. British officials learned from it too. If they moved against supplies, the countryside might rise. Colonists began removing stores from obvious locations. Cannon disappeared from places British troops expected to find them. Militias drilled more openly. Minutemen prepared for rapid response. Communities debated who could be trusted. In December 1774, colonists in New Hampshire seized powder and arms from Fort William and Mary after hearing rumors that British authorities might reinforce the post. This showed that the crisis was not only a Massachusetts problem. Still, Massachusetts remained the center. Gage had orders to suppress rebellion and seize supplies. Patriot leaders watched him closely. British officers watched roads, towns, and informers. Spies moved in both directions. Everyone understood that another expedition into the countryside could become the test. By early 1775, Parliament declared Massachusetts to be in a state of rebellion. More troops were ordered. The ministry believed firmness could still restore authority. In Massachusetts, many believed firmness had already become tyranny. The powder keg was built, only a spark remained. In April 1775, British attention turned to Concord. Patriot military supplies were believed to be stored there. Gage planned a secret expedition to seize or destroy them and possibly arrest leading Patriot figures, including Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were staying in Lexington. But secrecy was difficult in Massachusetts. Patriot networks watched British movements in Boston. Signals were prepared, riders were ready. Paul Revere, William Dawes, and others would carry warnings into the countryside. The story later became legend, but beneath the legend was a real communication system built over years of resistance. On the night of April 18th, British troops crossed the water and began marching toward Concord. Warnings spread, riders moved through dark roads, militia and Minutemen began gathering. In homes and taverns, men took down muskets. Families understood that the long crisis might finally be turning into war. Lexington lay on the road. Concord waited beyond it. Most people involved did not yet know they were entering the first day of a revolution. British soldiers believed they were carrying out an operation to seize illegal military supplies. Massachusetts militiamen believed they were defending their communities and rights. Few knew how quickly a confrontation could become history. The years before that night had made the moment possible. The Stamp Act had taught resistance. The Sons of Liberty had taught organization. The Townshend Crisis had brought troops to Boston. The Boston Massacre had created martyrs. Committees of Correspondence had built networks. The Tea Party had forced punishment. The Intolerable Acts had made Massachusetts a continental cause. The First Continental Congress had given resistance a shared political form. The powder alarm had shown how fast the countryside could rise. So when the British marched in April 1775, they did not enter a quiet province. They entered a landscape already organized for alarm. Episode 1 begins where this prologue ends. On the road, in the dark, with riders spreading the warning and armed men gathering before dawn.